Welcome to this video on the Zenwar channel. My name is Shri Satguru, Buddha, Rawa Bhagwan. Today's video we're going to talk a little bit about the system. We're going to talk a little bit about building security. Okay? So buildings represent something within the computer system, within the program. Okay, and what they represent is they represent a storage place for ourselves, for our objects where we sleep, right? A place of security, hopefully, a place of safety, right? A place of shelter against the elements, right? Against the forces of nature, right? Proper built settlement will often have a foundation or a good solid base, right? We'll have its walls, right? We'll have its entrance points, okay, its windows, all that, but its roof, right? And its protection against the elements in different ways, including something sometimes on the roof to deflect from elements or something like that. Some spiritual protections might be also understanding that a building is a spiritual construct, right? So buildings use many materials, right? We use many trees, we make metal, we take materials out of the earth and we bring it all together and we process it all together in our minds and with our tools, our hands and the machines that we build to do it for us. We turn these into materials, right? We transform natural things like metals and refine them and all these different things, and we build skyscrapers and beautiful buildings and universities and beautiful buildings and all these different things and homes of people, right? Whether it be condo buildings or individual houses, right? We build all these constructs, right? So we transform, right? Third level materials, so materials that are just pulled from nature, right? That we take from nature, that we interact with. A tree, well, it's good to have a saw or something, to cut the tree, right? If you try to cut it with your hands, well, it's more difficult, right? So, all these processes that we put in place to transform nature, right? To transform into a nature that fulfills our needs in a better way, right? So we fulfill it according to our needs, right? According to the plans we put in place for today and for the future, right? So some cultures think about planning for the future and some is more about today, right? So you want to be thinking about today, but thinking about the future and having plans, right? And goals and working towards those goals, and so you can achieve those goals. Because if you don't set goals and work towards them and put in place the processes at the micro and macro levels to achieve them, then you won't achieve those goals, If you just keep thinking about them and dreaming about them and never actually do the work to put them in place, then they won't happen, right? So you have to plan for those and use the resources that you have, right? Resources are somewhat limited in the context that they are what you can use and apply from nature and transform within a specific period of time, the resources that you have available and tools to do so and to put it in place and build with. Well, in that way, all things are transformed at their pace, right? So buildings are built with materials, okay? So what does that mean is that you have many, many different stories which come into buildings, right? Because there are many stories in nature, many, many, many stories. And all the different expressions of nature and metals and all these and stone, buildings can be built out of stone too, right? Or wood and all these things. These hold vibrations, right? So a tree represents something in the story, right? It is alive. It represents a force, right? A force of nature, right? A tree. And also a stone represents something too, okay? Often with the stories of ancestors within them, etc. Okay, so there are vibrationary stories that exist within constructs that can hold stories and constructs that can have awareness, right? Because a stone can have awareness as a tree can have awareness as well. Okay, so there are different forms of awareness and different constructs or bodies, okay, or vehicles that can hold awareness and within which awareness can develop as well, right? So awareness develops from nature, right? And also awareness transforms nature, right? And hopefully doesn't destroy it, right? Because then that's nature destroying itself. So in an ideal world, the awareness of nature, right, which is the organisms on the planet which are become sentient and aware, right? are of different planets, the organisms of planets, and the different levels of organisms, right? Hopefully, the ones that are at those higher levels of awareness on the planet have the awareness to know that they have to take care of their home and all that, right? And be sustainable on their planet and also help the planet, not just take from it, right? And its processes and all that. So that's awareness, right? Because we're all living organisms on the planet. We all belong to the planet and we're all connected to the planet. So if you're from a specific planet, you're connected to that planet, right? And the odds are you're going to probably stay on that planet for the rest of your life, except if you're an individual that travels in between planets or something like that, or different stories like that in different vehicles. Once again, different ships or something like that. So you're connected to your planet. You're part of that organism, right? Connected to the stories of it and all those different things, right? And connected to the stories of your ancestors and your lineage as well, right? Your blood lineage, right? And your magical lineage, right? Because there are lokas of magic and fairy tales. So people and some people are beings of power, right? That have roles in part of the fairy tale stories or other stories of power, which give them powers within the story, right? So, anyways, we get back to houses, right? So houses are built, okay, by different people who have different knowledge about how to build houses. Okay, so we have knowledge how to build houses, technology that we maintain, right? And also the tools that we have available, right? Allow us to build different levels of houses in different places for different people. So based on that technology, the materials available, the resources available, different houses can be built and planned for. And we can build, and that leads to societies, for example, to small villages, which leads to the city, right? And there's many things on history about the city and the development of the city and the city state, and then growing from the city into multiple cities and territories, and then growing to countries, and the great creation of patriotism and nationalism and all these things, right? Which didn't exist before. So buildings, okay, are a building block of society. Okay, so when we put in place a building, it's also something stable. It's a place of stability. It's a place that stays there and holds. And depending on how well it's built and how efficiently and with materials and all these things and with the knowledge it's built, it is more or less stable and obviously subject to the whims of nature as well, but probably there for a longer time, as long as probabilities would hold, you know. So except if something like an earthquake or something comes, you know, if you build a good proper building, it's going to probably be there for a long time. If you design it well and you have good materials and it's well built, you know, the odds are it's going to hold up, right? And that, so basically a building becomes a building block for society, right? And then we build one, we build two, we build three, and then society concentrates and develops around the concentrations of these buildings. So life takes place in these buildings, and they are also where people sleep, right? Right? So where people sleep and reside. So it's also the place where you're saved in a way when you go to sleep, right? A place where you have a safe save, right? When you go to sleep, right? A saving place, right? And a loading place for you to load back up safely and to spend the night safely when you're not in your body, right? When you're sleeping, to rest, place to have your stuff, right? All your cooking stuff, all your leisure stuff after that, right? And then outside of the home is the place where you can have other buildings where you keep, for example, livestock that you eat, or where you have fields that you plow, and you know that you seed, and all these different things to basically create life out of the earth, right? So then buildings become a place and have a role within the system as a safe saving place, right? That you can potentially own or rent, okay, or something like that, or share, for example, or you'd be part of a family that occupies it, or something like that, right? So it is a safe, saving, loading, storing place, right? And it is safe according to how safe the area around it is, right? So it is not necessarily, it is only safe as long as the area around in which that building is safe, right? So and also anything can happen anytime. Let's not forget that too, right? A lot of different technologies and people in the universe and creation, in parallel universes. So are you truly ever fully safe? But you can kind of take what you do, the measures you can to be okay, to be well, to be comfortable and safe as much as you can, as long as you have the means to do so. So you can make sure that you try to have the means to do so. So a building, right? A building is that place where life is concentrated, right? Where life takes place, where life saves itself. Okay, is conserved, a conservation place for life, right? Back in the day, they didn't have buildings. They had to figure out shelters like caves, or have temporary shelters that they would build, huts, things like that. Tents, things like this with skins and all these different things. So a building, depending on how well it is built, the technology you have, and the resource and production capability to transform nature, right, at different levels of society, the more solid and well lasting you can build them, right, with technology and understanding of what is required for that specific area of the world in which you're building it, right? So you can build it appropriate to survive and be comfortable, and be a lasting place. So what it is, it's basically a presence, right, on the street, a presence on the land, right, a place of permanence, right, a place of residing, right, a place of saving that is occupied and belongs to someone, right? So a building is very important, and a building contains stories, right? So it contains all the materials that were built, put inside that building. Now these materials were formed and shaped and melded and blended and put into a specific shape, right? So this basically frameworks the material and its use for the building, right? But at the same time, the materials retain the stories that were within them, right? So that's important to remember when you're using materials. They retain the stories that are part of those materials, right, that are ingrained within them. And even if you forge them, they maintain the properties of that material, right? So it's important to remember that, right? So wood retains the properties of wood even if you forge it into something, even if you carve it into something. And metal retains the properties of metal no matter what shape you put it in, right, etc. So it's important to remember that things retain their properties, and then you can use technology to put them in certain shapes and forms and applications, and put those together with other shapes and form of applications of different things to develop building blocks to build iterations of new technologies, right? So the buildings are very important in our society. Okay, as you have observed, if you're part of society, right, a building is a very important place, right, and forms the basis for the building blocks of society and its evolution moving forward, right, and its growth, right, and its conservation and the life that takes place within the buildings and the cities of this world, right? So once again, as there is a relationship between people moving towards the country and people moving towards the city, and jobs being in the city, but people loving the life of the country. So there's a relationship between those things, right? And a flow backwards and forwards as you move through different cycles of time and space. Preferences towards being in the cities or preferences towards being in the country, but all the time you find the building, right? The building. So people talk about the city as the building block of nations and all that, but technically it is the building, which is the building block of nations and all these different things, right? For it is the building which, as it multiplies and grows and is protected, and multiple buildings are protected, right, that we lead to, the building leads to the village leads to the city leads to the nation state leads to the country, all these different things, right? But let's not forget the importance of the building. And the building has stories, okay? The materials has stories, and these are the stories of the land, okay? The stories of the past, which have ingrained themselves in the history of these materials and their vibrations. For these materials absorb vibrations and sometimes project vibrations as well, right? So a house can absorb vibrations coming from the outside and also protects against them, the individuals inside sometimes, and also absorbs and receives and projects. Also, a building can project vibrations as well, right? For example, if you see a very beautiful building and you pass by it, it projects on you. Oh, wow, that's a nice building. Well, it projected on you. Something projected on you. You know, you saw that it was a nice building, right? Or an impressive fort or castle or something like that. Oh, that looks imposing. I wouldn't have wanted to attack that with an army in the medieval ages or something like that, you know? It impresses on you. Or a wonderful temple in India or something like that. You know, you look at it and you're like, that's amazing how they built that. You know, imagine getting the Vimana at the top and all these things. You know, difficult things, right? And very impressive applications of skill and knowledge and determination of humanity. All right, so the building is very impressive, and look at the example of India. You know, you have temples and cities that built around temples, right? Around a murti, an idol of God or the goddess, right? Cities very much built around them, basically. You know, because that's just so important. And so you see the building, the temple construct, the construct of that facility, that building led to the creation of a city, right? Led to the village, led to the city, which became part of a nation, became part of a state, and different buildings leading to creations around them, right? Growing around them, and then other things happening at the same place in other places, right? Because you have a relationship between the microcosm and the macrocosm, which is not only upwards and downwards, but also horizontal, right? Not only vertical, but horizontal. So away from you, you have also buildings and society growing around buildings, and then elsewhere buildings, society growing around buildings, and then eventually these societies grow and start meeting each other, right? As different pockets of humanity all over the world grow and then basically come into contact with each other. So what you have is you have the stories of different buildings, right? And all the stories of everything that took place and absorbed in those buildings, right? And led to that story growing and concentration with other buildings beside it, right? Meeting other stories. So you have stories meeting stories, vibrations meeting vibrations, different culture, tradition, type of people, color, skin, etc., meeting others, right? Different stories of the land and the stories that are contained within those buildings, right? And the growth of those buildings. So as the stories grow and as the stories move, the growth of those buildings and the stories of those buildings takes place. And buildings can even be sentient. Okay, that's something to remember, because these materials within them can develop sentience and have sentience, right? So by forging them, you don't necessarily take away the sentience in the object, if you know what you're doing as a master forger or mason or crafter that knows how to build a building, you know, or engineer or constructor or everything, you know. So there are techniques to build the building in a specific way so that it becomes a spiritually established building as well, right? Versus a building that has no protections, you build it as a building that has protections, right? That serves a purpose that is well conceived, thought out, planned, right? Put into motion, well built, you know, with good materials and with good skill and knowledge, and doing certain things to the building to protect it, right? So in some traditions, for example, in Peru and things like that, what they'll do is they'll have a lama and they have a consecration to the mother, the earth goddess, right? Pachamama and all these things, offering things before they build a home, and all these different techniques, right? So you basically say this is becoming a consecrated, a permanent space, right? A place where life will exist, right? Where we concentrate life. So we bless it. We have the blessings of the nature, that they will know that this will become a permanent place and that there will be growth coming from here, life coming from here, family coming from here, work coming from here, life coming from here, saving of things here, saving of life here, right? Protection of life here. All these different things. So you do that with the gods, with the authority, with the of nature and creation, right? You establish a permanent place, a place of residing or dwelling, right? A place of life, of existence, a building, right? So the building is the source of the village. The building is the source of the city. The building is the source of the nation state. And as the level of the buildings that you find the stories which influence the development of the microcosm and the macrocosm, right? Because that's where the life is taking place within the buildings, right? You also have life taking place where you have concentration of the people who live in the buildings, right? When they go out of the buildings. And sometimes events are decided in that way outside of the buildings, but the life and the events are also decided inside of those buildings, which make the buildings the foundation blocks for the evolution of life and the place where the evolution of life takes place. Okay, so as a society develops and grows, they must develop dwelling places. Okay, buildings is what it's called, and that can take different forms in different like civilizations and species, right? And the better they are built, the more permanent they are, the less subject they are to instability and change, the more stability there is for that society to develop and grow and to meet its higher potentials of existence and development in the story, right? So buildings are extremely important. Okay, so buildings maintain stories, and buildings can achieve a certain level of sentience. So there becomes, from all the individual stories of all the materials that are put within the building, all the things in the walls and the floor and the ceilings, everything, the roof, all that, all the materials, okay, and the sentience and awareness and all of the stories within them, they become part of the story of the building, part of the greater story of that building, right? And this greater story of that building has all the other stories of all the other materials. So it absorbs the new material that's put within it, right? All the materials come together, all participating and all working together and coming together to become part of a dwelling or a story, right? Of growth of the story. So materials that, were just in their raw form become elevated, right? They become enlightened, as our buildings are even enlightened with light, right? With light and with knowledge and with truth and spiritual practice and all these different things. So these materials become uplifted from their raw shape and form as raw parts of the story and the building blocks of creation and nature, and they become enlightened and part of the story of humanity. So the story of humanity and other species takes place within these buildings and constructs and vehicles that we build that are like buildings, like cars, right? You can sleep in a car if you want, just not a very practical place, but it's a form of vehicle construct, and you also have to have a place to save your car, and that's a construct that moves around, but it's similar to a building. You can save your stuff within it. You can put something on the back seat and save it, and when you come back, it'll be back, right? So it is a form of construct. That one's a moving one, a moving building in a way, a moving construct where you can save things and where life takes place and allows you to do the processes of life. But you have permanent buildings which take permanent place and cannot be moved easily, right? And have more permanency, such as residential buildings, right? Versus vehicles, right? So there is a distinction between vehicles and a permanent place that does not move, right? But both have their advantage and their disadvantages, because in a situation where you have to leave your building and go somewhere else, well, a vehicle is more practical than the permanent one. But in a situation where you want to have a comfortable life, and a fully established and developed life that grows, a place with a nice bed and all that to sleep and have a comfortable life, you're going to want a residence, right? Not a vehicle that you sleep in the back seat, right? Not comfortable, you know? So both become part of creation, and a relationship between mobile vehicles, okay, or immobile if they're old vehicles, and I guess still vehicles but don't move anymore. So vehicles versus residences, okay, and there is a difference, right? So residences and vehicles, right? So the purpose of an object, the purpose of its construct, but what they are both in both cases is a container, one that moves, right, according to the infrastructure that allows it to move that we have developed, and its purpose and the ability to move, whether that be an unmodified natural resources like an SUV that can go in a field, for example, or even if the field's a bit rough, versus a vehicle that cannot go into a field with holes and all these things. So different purposes of vehicles and buildings. So the building is the building block of society, the building block of civilization, the place where life takes place, right? Where life is safeguarded and where life grows, right? Where when life grows to higher levels, we need buildings, right? We need residential places for life to take place, right? If not, life doesn't develop and advance in ways of technology and all of these different things, right? Because, you know, without a building, think about it. Let's say you're trying to build an advanced technological construct. You don't have a roof over your head, you know, well, the rain's going to hit it and everything electrical is going to fry. You know, so you need to have a building, okay? And you're not going to be in the cave probably trying to build an advanced construct at a very high scale for everybody on your planet, right? You need buildings, right? You need places of residence. And that's where the building block of society is, and where the stories of nature, okay, come together in all the different parts of the building, right? They come from different parts of the land, you know, stories coming from that area, right? Rock or stone or brick from that area, or story or trees from that forest, right? All coming together, all the stories coming together to become part of that building. And the building has a spiritual importance, right? The building is a technology, right, that we use, right? And we use different technologies to build the overall technological design of a building, right? The building becomes the project, right? And it has lots of different technologies that come together and build the technological prowess and completeness of that technological construct, which is the building, built out of those materials with all those stories of nature, right? And our technologies have their stories as well, right? So it's all stories coming together into a story house, right? A story building, right? Which is held together by an accumulation and memory of stories, which is stored in the materials of the building, okay, and which influence on the life which takes place in the building, in the relationship between those materials and the life of that building. Okay, so you interact, you clean your house, you clean your floor, you clean your walls, you paint your walls. When there's a scratch, you fix the scratch, or you don't. You know, maybe you put a scratch because you're doing a process on your building and you're doing something like that, or putting a ruin somewhere. You put protections on your building. You do things with salt on your building, or you don't. You put shields on your building, or you don't, if you know about these things, or you don't. Who lives in the building? Is it as a powerful being that put power in their building and protections, and their building interacts with the world or blends with the world, or is defended from the world with shields and barricades and drawbridges and all these different things and walls and, you know, all these different things. So there are different types of buildings, okay? Like there are different types of people living in those buildings, okay? As there are more advanced people spiritually, there are more advanced buildings spiritually, okay? So it's important to remember that. And it's not because a building is not advanced spiritually that you don't have an advanced spiritually person within it, you know? But, you know, there are different levels of advancement spiritually on buildings as well. Levels that can be seen, technologies that can be seen and that cannot be seen, right? That are put on buildings. So there are visible technologies to buildings and there are invisible technologies to buildings. But buildings are story houses where stories come together and are conserved, right? And where the story of life interacts with the stories of nature, right? But are conserving, all coming together in a concentrated place, right? So where nature is stories here, stories there, all kind of floating around, taking place in different places and interacting, right? Now a building is bringing all those stories together, concretizing them together in a form of life so that that concentration of stories can give birth to higher levels of enlightened or elevated or illumined life, so higher levels of development of society. So bringing all our stories, our base stories, our raw stories, our core stories of nature and humanity and life and sentient life and intelligence, and concretizing them, crystallizing them into the building, crystallizing them into that residential living spot, you know, or for commercial also, because there are residential buildings and there are commercial buildings, and they fall in two different categories of categorization. Okay, as there are industrial buildings and all these different things as well, right? So buildings fall in different categorizations in those elements as well. So, you know, from the first residential type building, which is the shelter, right? We move into other buildings which have specific purposes, right? So we see that different types of buildings can give a use for different purposes. So buildings allow for the building block are the building blocks for the purpose of humankind, for the purpose of sentient intelligent vehicle activities, of SIVAs, right? You might have heard that name of God, Siva, right? Sentient intelligent vehicle activity, and all the people, and you might have heard that people are made in the image of God, right? So they're made in that image as sentient intelligent vehicle activities as well. Okay, so we have the building, which with its purpose allows the expression of the purpose of the human mind. Okay, the purpose of the expression of intelligence, right? So the building becomes the building block for the growth and permanence of the growth of intelligence and life, because life and intelligence come together and they are known as light. So a building becomes a crystallized place where light is contained, right? And as long as the building is vibrant and full of light and sustained, well, it becomes a place where light resides, right? And some buildings are built in a way specifically so that that light that resides there can be shared with the people that come to that building, and transform the people that come to that building. And that is the concept of a shetram, a zone of transformation, right? Which is often established, if not with buildings, then with physical constructs and markers, which is essentially put an anchor of that shetram onto a land, right? So when you have a land, for example, with a city or all these different things, or a specific part of land where you know that there are certain stories on that land, you can also purposefully establish buildings or temples to grid that land energetically, so that you basically establish a place of permanence and control over certain stories, right? By gridding that land. So temples can also be used as energetic grids to maintain or control or hold back or promote things by gridding a part of the land, okay, in an energetic grid which has influence upon all the microcosm and macrocosm of creation. So buildings can be used as technologies, right, to basically modify, to change story and the stories and how they move forward into the future. So buildings are very important, okay? They allow the growth of life and the growth of the expression of intelligence of life, okay? So buildings are very important, and they're built in different ways, okay, depending on the different culture. Let me take a sip of coffee here. You reside in a building, most likely, okay? Well, hopefully you do, because it's better to reside in a building and have a place in a building than not to. It's a more comfortable place than not having a place in a building, usually, right? And it's a place to stay. So I am currently in a building, right? And a building is being used in this way as an expression of life, allowing me to reside here and be comfortable here in relative quietness, to give you knowledge, to give you truth about buildings, right? To allow the expression of intelligence. So the building is allowing the truth and knowledge of buildings to be shared with the world and the growth of that. So buildings can be conceived and designed in different ways, and there are different traditions of building them, and building them with different shields, protections, spiritual protections, all these different things. Because buildings are a spiritual construct, and they are subject to spiritual attack or spiritual disturbance, or spiritual stability, depending on how well they're built and how that building is being maintained and protected, and all these different things. So there are technologies to protect the building spiritually, right? If you don't protect the building spiritually, it's not the same thing as a spiritually protected building, right? So there are different technologies at that level. There is also something called ownership of the building, and this is a thing within the system. There are different traditions which establish ownership of a building in different ways. So there is physical ownership, okay, according to the loca that's currently being experienced, right, by the individual in that building, right? Do they have physical ownership and rights over that building or not? And what are the conditions to maintain physical ownership in systems where you don't automatically maintain physical ownership of your building? And then there are also something called spiritual ownership. So the actual ownership of the building, who it really belongs to spiritually, right? As there is spiritual ownership of the building as well. And sometimes spiritual ownership and physical ownership come together. Most cases, it is the same person. Okay, so spiritual or physical ownership. But in some cases, there are exceptions where physical ownership is not had, but there is spiritual ownership of a building, and that leads to disturbances for other people who would go into that building who don't have spiritual ownership of that building, or not if there is no disturbance. So there is such a thing as the ownership of the building. Okay, so there is a master story running around each building and all the materials and all the stories in those materials contributing to that building. A greater story, and that is the story related to that building and who it spiritually belongs to, right? And the stories of that individual and all those different things. So that comes in relation with the stories of the building. And there is a harmony, a symbiosis between the greater stories of the building and the story of its ownership and its occupants, or there is no harmony and its occupants will probably move out and not stay there for a long time, or there was a harmony for a certain given time and then the occupants moved out. So the stories of the building have a history, right? A history of the occupants and those vibrations, right? So we know that materials absorb spiritual vibration. So if there is occupants and practice of spirituality in a building, maybe that building retains that spiritual practice within the materials of that building as well, or also the neighborhood can retain in case of strong spiritual practitioners, or even a city can retain spiritual benefit, or even a country, for example, if a Kshetram is established at that level of a spiritual land, right? So we know in India there is a protection around the land, a Kshetram of zone transformation in India. Well, this can be established in other lands as well by spiritual practitioners as well, right? So these are things, technologies, and how they can be applied. So in other lands, we can also establish grids and temples on the land and all these things. And these are the things that maintain a tradition and a lineage and a culture and a belief system through the ages and thousands of years. When we build in stone and grid temples and all these things on the land, and we customize them to the specifications of the land and the belief systems of the people of that land. So using technology to establish permanency, and growth within the stories of our land and our species, essentially, by using buildings for specific purposes, including spiritual protection and spiritual growth. Because spiritual protection is a part of the sustenance long term of a people, right? Because spirituality is 99% of what's really going on, and the physical world is 1%. So imagine that a building which has a spiritual effect is very important because it touches on 99% of life, right? And also the harmony of life with the divine and all that, right? In which we seek sustenance and protection, right? Out of faith. So cultures like in India, they know about these things, and most of the society invest in temples and things like that. You put the gold in the temple, you don't put it on your home, so on the temple roof, right? So people know these things. In different cultures of the world see it in different ways, but the building is very important, okay? It's very important. So let's talk about the papacy, for example. Did you know that at one point there was two popes, right? Or more popes. I don't know the full story here. I'd have to check, re-look up on my history. But there were multiple popes, different buildings in which popes existed. So those popes and those buildings were very important, and became the centers of the circle of influence of those popes. Look today, the Vatican, the St. Peter's Basilica, all these different things, all these places which are buildings, right? A church is a building, right? And a place, a regroupment of society, right? A place where the message of light of God is shared with people, etc. Right? So buildings have a purpose and an importance, right? And their impact, it can be very, very huge, because the importance of a church, on and what is said in the church will have an importance on the people living in the area, right? So that building and what takes place in that building is important. And the same thing for a temple, which is a social place where people come together, a gurdwara, for example, a synagogue, right? An ashram, a place of learning, right? A mosque, a Buddhist temple, a Hindu temple, all these places people come together and learn and transform, right? Through these buildings, transform people and have a place and a role in the life of people, right? Buildings are also where people go after work to relax, to have at the restaurant or at the bar to have a drink, to relax, where life takes place, right? Where life changes. Maybe you go to a bar and you meet your next your wife or something like that, or you go to a library and you meet your wife or something like that, right? Or anywhere in a class at school, in a building. So the building and has an impact on your life, and the stories of that building which brought you and your wife together into that story of that building, right? And where you met, so you became a part of the story of that building because you met there, or you were a part of the story of that building, and the story of you meeting becomes a story of that building and its memory, right? So you're connected to that building in that way, in a way, and the stories are all connected anyways. And don't forget that stories connect from one building to the next, because buildings are connected and separated by different things, so we have separate buildings separated by walls and fences and all these different things, and but there are also things connecting those buildings, right? So some stories are limited to some buildings, and some stories can connect to different buildings and bring different buildings together in greater stories. So buildings are story houses connected to other story houses in different ways, or not connected in different ways, depending if you put shields that block certain kind of connections or things like that, right? So remember that it's always possible to connect with something that's not connected if you try to hack it hard enough, right? So connections are only so good as they have an ability to hit back, right? If you allow someone to test your connections over and over again, eventually they might break down. You might have to switch up your protection, something like that. So you have to protect, you have to monitor, right? You have to respond if someone tries to take down your protections of your building or something like that, then you try to respond by doing something different techniques. So sometimes people try to play around with ownership of buildings, try to steal ownership of buildings, steal presence in the stories of buildings. So there's an art in protecting your buildings, right? In protecting their establishment and their purpose, right? So that buildings cannot be modified from their intentional purpose and ownership, right? Like a computer system. You need to protect your computer systems, antiviruses, all these things. So you need to do the same thing for buildings and their stories, right? Because they are also systems that are operating, and they're actually within our computer systems are actually within our buildings, right? So you see that it all comes down to the buildings. The building is the origin of the computer system, and the computer system resides within the building. The computer system has protection mechanisms, but so does the building, right? So does your building systems, right? Your building essential systems, such as your internet, etc. So you see that everything comes down to the building. If someone corrupts your building's protection systems, such as your building internet or something like that, they come into your internet, they come into your internal systems, your computer, which is within your building, right? So you have your shields protecting someone from penetrating your building and its inside systems, right? Your defenses, right? Your moats, your fences, your mechanisms to protect you, thick walls, solid walls, locks on doors, all these different things. So the building is the fundamental place that you have to defend when you're a practitioner that lives in a building, and everybody's a security practitioner in this world because we're all computer systems, we're all programs. So you have to protect your systems and your containers and your information, right? Because information resides within containers. The building is a container, and it is also information. That's an interesting thing about the building. It is built with information, and information that becomes a container, right? So it is unique in that way. It is an informational container. Okay, so buildings are very important. Okay, and there are technologies to build them well and secure them spiritually and physically. Okay, so it's important to remember the relationship between the physical and the spiritual. Okay, some things, for example, some people, what they'll do is if their building is, they feel like they're losing control over their building, they'll try to renovate the building to put it under construction or renovations or something like that, or put barriers around their building, such as metal barriers, such as fences, construction fences, block off accesses to the building, change the things in the building, change the walls, change the structure, change the room setup, so that you modify the overall understanding of the building, so that someone who has overall understanding which is superior, who is guiding, for example, the renovations, such as the owner of the building, will have a greater knowledge of the building systems than anyone who's trying to take it over, right? So that's why you would consider things like information about essential systems and layout or plans of the building to be confidential information, because you don't want someone having a better understanding of your building than you, because you represent the ownership of your building, and you want to have a better understanding than anyone else, right? Because you want to have understanding of the ownership of that building and its stories. So there's understanding of the physical principles of the building, which someone could theoretically try to abuse to take ownership of a building, right? The physical systems and protections of the building. But there's also ownership of all the spiritual stories of the building and the land in which that building exists, right? So there are different levels of knowledge and power and ability in the ability to wrest ownership of building and lands from people. So you can try to gate crash a building spiritually, and take ownership of that building and influence the life of the people, the life that takes place in that building moving forward. So the security of a building, the stability of a building, the protections of a building become very important to the security, stability, and protection, and really stability, and the opposite of chaos, of the life taking place within those buildings, right? So you can transform buildings and bless buildings and turn them into zones of transformations, and also into places where life is secure and well protected and all those different things too, right? Where forces that would seek to influence the life that's in those buildings are repelled by that building, where the building actually becomes a protector of the life inside the building spiritually. So that it could become a place where people can actually relax as well. You enter a secure place, even if your protections are not so good, well, the protections of the place that you were welcomed in now protect you, from the elements and outside and crazy stories of nature and spiritual beings and magical beings and all these things and fairy folk and all these things, all these protections. You enter a building that's designed to protect its occupants or the people that are welcome. So within that building, you are safe, right? So that's a good feeling as well. So a good place will protect its occupants and the people that are allowed to be safe within it, right? The life that is allowed to exist and thrive and be welcome within it as a visitor or as an owner or as the family of the owner or a family of a visitor or something like that. Someone who's allowed inside, for who the door is opened and they're welcomed inside. The building, they have a legit right to be inside the building and to benefit from the protections of the building while they're inside it, or of the society, right? If they're in the streets, in between two buildings or something like that, the protection of the city and the walls of the city, right? So the building and the collection of buildings have stories and protections, physical and spiritual, that protect the inhabitants of the building, or the regrouping of multiple buildings in a city or a village or something like that, right? And the security mechanisms of those buildings. So spiritually, buildings that are protected, that are well established, will protect spiritually the people that are within them when they're within them. Which means, obviously, that if you're leaving the protection of the building, you may be entering into a zone of more danger, right? And think about it, it's very rare that someone dies in their home, except of old age or a disease or something like that. But when you leave your building, you go into the streets, you go into car accidents, all these different things. A lot of people, things can happen. You go somewhere, you go to a trip, you're not careful, something can happen, accidents, things like that too. Versus, so you could say that you're more safe in a building than you are outside of it, right? In most cases. But then there are certain exceptions to that, such as if the building is coming down, right? In an earthquake or something like that. So in most cases, you are most safe inside the building, and the building's story protects you while you are within the building, right? And if it is a well-conceived building with well-conceived stories, well-established, well-masoned, well-formed, well put in place, then it should protect you well, And if it's not a good building and the stories and technologies in it are old or not well maintained or something like that, the roof could fall down on your head or something, and you would not be safe in the building. You would die in the building. So you hope that you enter into a building that is safe, that has good technologies, and that you have a good time when you're in a building, right? And that it is there to protect life and sustain life and grow life and to give a purpose to the expression of intelligence of life, right? To allow the growth of our intelligence and its impact on the world in which we are, right? So buildings allow us to program the world in different ways, and so do streets between buildings, etc. So we grid the earth, we grid the world with our streets, with our buildings, and these become essentially the different functions, right, of the computer system that we personify into our buildings. So our buildings become a grid on the computer system in which we are, right? So we build with our buildings, so they become, in a way, computer programs to themselves, which are built from different elements of code, right? Of materials and stories and technology, which all come together into governing programs for our intelligence, right? So buildings become very important, as do vehicles, which are like buildings, but have the capacity to move, right? So some buildings can move. You have buildings on boats, and they can move. So there is a interconnection between vehicles and buildings. You have stationary buildings, right, on land, and you have or somewhere else. You could have a stationary one in space or in the air as well, technically. Okay, and then you have moving ones. So that's often where I draw the distinction between a vehicle and a building. So you can have vehicles that have a building built within them, right, which give all the advantages of a building, and then you can have a building. So as long as they have a space, right, on the earth, right, or on the method of sustenance on which they are, if they're in the air, so a space in the air or a space in the water or a space on the earth, right, where they have their space, right, and where they can retain that space over time, then that gives them a permanence, right, as a vehicle, or a permanence as a building which is stationary. So vehicles, buildings. So what you can see is that if there is that connection between vehicles and buildings, what we are actually talking about is containers. And containers that are allowed to retain their space in time and space, okay? Allowed to move around potentially, okay? So moving containers, and containers that contain information, right? So all it is the movement of information and containers within the Kala Chakra. Okay. Thank you for listening to this video on buildings. Have a great day.